In our next session, we have Clare in conversation with our festival director and popular Times of India columnist, Vinita Dawra Nangia. Let's start the session with a big round of applause.
Clare as yet has not written any physiological thrillers. She's done some psychological thrillers, definitely.
I'm going to give it a go, though.
Yes, definitely. She's going to give it a try after this. So here with me is Clare Mackintosh, and Clare Mackintosh is one of the leading writers of psychological thrillers. I came across her books by that time she'd written her second one. And when I got hold of the second one, for some reason I wanted to read the first one before I read the second one. So I got hold of I Let You Go, which was your first book. I read through that, and then after that I read I See You. And I was totally hooked onto her, and by that time the third book came out. And the third is Let Me Lie. Beautiful books, all of them, and I love reading them, but what is even more exciting is that Clare was a cop for 12 years. She's from Britain and she was a cop for 12 years. After that she gave up that work and started writing. So why did you do that, Clare?
Okay, so I loved being a police officer, is the first thing. It was a great career. And I had every intention of staying as a police officer. I was getting promoted, I was going up through the ranks, and I wanted to be a senior police officer. And then when I was an inspector, sort of in the middle, and I was preparing to be a chief inspector, I had to do an appraisal. And it's an appraisal called a 360, where you send a questionnaire to all the people you work with, your peers, your bosses, your team, and they fill out, they answer questions about what you're like as a person. It's quite a difficult process to go through. And what you're left with is a report that tells you what other people think of you. And when this report came through, I was really pleased with it. And it talked about how I was really energetic and smiling, and I always had time for everybody, and I was, a really positive person. And I was so pleased that I took it home to show my husband, and he read the report, and he said, "Yeah, this is great. Who's this woman? I don't see this woman at home." And what I realised was something that I think a lot of us are guilty of. I was much nicer to my work colleagues than I was being to my family. I was giving my family all the leftovers of me, and that wasn't right, and so I quit the police. But the only thing I knew how to do, apart from be a police officer, was write, and so that's what I started doing.
Okay, very interesting. I must say our inspectors look rather different from Clare over there. I wish we had more inspectors like you as well. And nor have I heard of very many kind and nice and sweet ones. But that's nice and refreshing.
We have a very different approach to policing, I think,
Yeah.
on general. Police officers in Britain. Well, you're armed. Are you armed? Do your police officers, do they carry guns here?
Yeah, they do.
So our police officers, most of them, don't have guns, and the system of policing in the UK is based on something called policing by consent, and it is literally the people allow us to police. And the person who founded the police, Sir Robert Peel in the UK, said very famously, the people are the police and the police are the people, and there's no difference between the two. Whereas that's very different in other countries, certainly in America, and perhaps here in India, there's a very distinct line between the law enforcers.
Yeah, we do have a similar slogan though in Delhi, with you, for you, always, Delhi Police. They say that, slogan sounds good. What you said about your profession and giving your good self, your entire everything, your niceties to your profession, and taking it away from home because you get less time with your people at home. That is true for most women professionals, wouldn't it be?
I think it's probably true of everybody, actually. I think if we're absolutely honest, if we're in a bad mood, we are far more likely to take it out on the people at home than our work colleagues. And I think that's something we probably need to look at and try and get some balance. Women are particularly prevalent to it, I think, possibly because traditionally, stereotypically, they are the ones that do more at home, and if they're trying to run a home, look after a family and do a job, that's a pretty tough cool. You know, I'm very lucky now. I have a husband who takes over the running of the house and looks after the kids, so I can focus on my job. But if you're trying to do everything, I think it's inevitable that that you're not very nice at times, and sometimes it's our kids and our partners that bear the brunt of that.
Yeah, because we are just not, it's not that we are just looking after home and office and everything, we are also fighting perceptions all the time. And we are always trying to struggle up beyond those perceptions. For instance, a man can be angry and get away with it, saying, oh, he's very good, he's so aggressive at work. But when a woman shouts and is angry, she says, she's so difficult, she's a problem.
Yes. No, men are assertive when they speak out, and women are aggressive. It's a very curious thing, and we've still got a long way to go before we have equality.
And that is true the world over. I mean, I speak to women from so many countries, and it seems to be true of almost everywhere, except Norway. Norway, Sweden. Somehow people
they're
there...
very progressive. But it's a little bit like the panellists just now were talking about how you can change a law, but that's not going to make a difference to how people think. And similarly, we've got lots of equality laws, but it's much harder to change an attitude that ultimately women are less important than men, which unfortunately is an attitude held by an awful lot of people.
You were lucky that you were able to give up one profession and just take to the other like fish to water, and you are doing so well in that. Read in your books the structure of your books, the way you write the copy, your writing itself. It seems like you were born to be a thriller writer rather than a cop. So was it something that you always wanted to do, always wanted to write? Did you try that as a youngster?
Yes, I really wanted to write all the way through my life. But when I was young, I didn't know anybody who was a writer. I didn't know anyone who worked in the arts. All the people I knew had proper jobs. You know, that they were teachers or doctors, or they worked in shops. They didn't do creative things. And it's something I'm really conscious of now that I have children, is to expose them to as many role models as possible. Because I had some great role models as a child, but they weren't in the media, they weren't in the creative industries. And so I work very hard now to show my kids that there's a whole range of professions. So I just didn't think about it as a job. I carried on writing for myself. And then when I was in the police, you know, you can't be very creative as a police officer, but what you are is a storyteller. You're telling true stories, but you're nevertheless finding a story. Because when you speak to a victim of crime and you have to take a victim statement, that victim doesn't give you a beginning, middle and an end. They start at the end, they tell you they've just been attacked. And then they tell you something that happened 20 years ago when they first saw this person who attacked them. And then they go back to the attack, and then they give you something in the middle. And actually what you have to do when you're interviewing them is you've got to find the story and work out what's relevant and what's not, and write it in a compelling way. You've got to write it with a beginning, middle and an end, because that statement is going to be the most important piece of evidence at a court. So I was telling stories, telling other people's stories all the time, and finding a voice for somebody that had come to me with a problem. And that experience actually is really valuable now as I write books, albeit that I'm writing fiction.
So it's like your storytelling skill came from the practice that you had at policing.
I think it really did. That and the inspiration that comes from working in an industry where you are dealing with people at a point of crisis. And so I would imagine it's very similar for people who work in the medical profession. When you deal with someone who has just experienced a terrible thing, either as a victim or a witness or even as an offender, it's a moment of high stress, and what you're seeing is somebody's emotions stripped raw. And that's a really interesting sort of point of observation for a writer.
Yeah, that's a direct peep into life as you see it.
Exactly that,
it's
yes.
Raw, it's there, and it touches you, it reaches out to you. When you write as a cop, you must have read other thrillers. What is it that you bring to your books that is missing in others?
So I think there are some really brilliant crime writers out there from lots of different countries, and a lot of them who research their books so well that I can't fault them on forensic accuracy or procedure. But what I think my books have is an authenticity that you can't really get unless you've been a cop. Because it's things like when you're talking about taking a detained person into a police cell, you can describe that. You know, we've seen it on TV, maybe you can go there and have a look. But unless you've worked there and you've spent hours in this horrible place with no windows, where it's dark when you go to work and it's dark when you come home from work, and it smells because there are people that haven't washed for, you know, weeks on end. Those are the sorts of detail that I think help to bring a scene to life for a reader. And it's very hard to replicate that unless you've been there.
So have a lot of other crime writers been doing it wrong?
No, not wrong. Not wrong at all. It's simply that somebody who has walked in those shoes themselves is able to add a layer to it that is a bit of a bonus, I think.
What about the procedures, the police procedure?
It's obviously a bit easier for me. So I know how a crime is investigated. I know the forensic process, and so what it does is it cuts down on the time that I don't need to do a lot of research on that. But I still check it. And I've been out of the police now since 2011, and things change all the time, and legislation changes. So actually, I would never write a critical piece of procedure without double-checking with someone who still works in the police.
One interesting thing that I've noticed in your books is that always the police officer who actually gets interested in the crime and gets passionate about solving it is not the one who's within the system, but the one who's just outside the system, running parallelly to it. So whether it is Anna in your book, Let Me Lie, and she's seeking help, so the system is not paying any attention to her, but it is the police officer who is actually working on a civilian job at that time, and he's out of the main system. He is the one who gets interested and helps her. Or if it was in your ICU, there again it is a woman officer who needs to prove herself for certain reasons, who gets excited about investigating Anna's complaint and actually gets into at the bottom. Is that a comment on the system, the institution, that they don't normally take seriously complaints that people come in with?
I think it's actually more of a comment on crime fiction, that there tends to be a focus on detectives. And in fact, it's something that I did in my first book. You know, my first book, I Let You Go, is a fairly sort of straightforward character. It's a male detective inspector. The job comes straight to him. And I think what I realised after I wrote that was that I wrote that because that's what the public expects, and they expect it because most crime fiction books have a detective inspector investigating things. It's from Morse onwards, it's been like that. Whereas the reality is that the people who, in the police, who pick up jobs are from all different departments, and the real brilliance is, it could just as easily be in a uniformed officer, it could be in a civilian at the front desk, it could be anywhere. And I wanted to showcase some of these roles in the police that do an incredible job and perhaps don't get the respect from the reading public that they deserve. With Let Me Lie, the newest book, Murray, who is the detective, the civilian investigator, is probably my favourite character. So I really loved him because he is non-traditional. He's retired, he worked as a detective for many years, but he's in his 60s now, and he's just working as a civilian on the police station front desk. And I worked with lots of people like him when I was in the police, people who had huge amounts of knowledge. And in Britain, certainly, I wonder actually if you're slightly better at this in India than we are in Britain. We have a very bad habit of dismissing elderly people and not recognising how important they are and how they should be cherished because they've got so much experience and so much skill. And we kind of write them off a bit and focus on the young, up-and-coming people. And so I wanted to showcase an older person.
And you also got the opportunity to showcase his sensitive side, his loving side, when he looks after his wife Sarah, who is suffering from a mental illness. And I think that's a beautiful part of the book. And you keep coming back to, again, mental health as a theme in your books.
I do. I think it's maybe one of my obsessions. I feel very strongly that we should be talking about mental health as much as we talk about physical health, if not more. We're very comfortable talking about physical health, and I could come up on stage with a broken leg and we'd have a chat about how I broke my leg, but you would not generally talk to someone about their mental health, and I wouldn't sit here saying I'm not feeling great. I've got a bit of depression and I've had an anxiety attack this morning. We're very uncomfortable about doing that, and yet we've all got mental health and it's all very important. So I've touched on it. I think whenever you write a book that touches on loss, grief, love, you're by default talking about mental health, because those are emotional, mental states that we get ourselves into, and they have an impact on our mental health.
Did you base these characters on like real life characters? Are these people you know, like the detectives or even Sarah for that?
The legal answer is no. They're all fictional. I base my characters on a sort of compilation of people that I know. So there will be a little...
Safer to say that.
It is always safer. There'll be a little bit of colleagues in the characters that I write. There's a little bit of me in almost every character, a trait or some sort of bit of it. But mostly, no, they are quite genuinely fictional creations.
And your first book, I'll Let You Go, was a very powerful emotional drama in the first half. I believe it also is close to you at heart, in the sense the experience that you did unfortunately lose a child who was very young, and were there bits of you in that part of your book?
Yes, very much so. I wrote quite extensively in I Let You Go about the process of moving on from a trauma, and it was a very therapeutic thing to do, actually. It was very difficult, and I cried a lot. It was an upsetting thing to do, but I felt better at the end of it.
Yeah, that is what writing does for you, really. It always cleanses you, makes you feel better, and it kind of, it's a good way to let the emotion out. If it were not psychological thrillers, what else would you have done? If you'd not been a cop, but you'd just gone to writing, and are you planning to get into any other genre, or is it always going to be psychological thrillers?
So I just finished writing a book which comes out in June, which has no police in it, no murders, no crimes.
Wow, that is quite something. Because now I'm used to you with crime and police.
I know, but we've just talked about mental health and loss and relationships, and some of the things that you've said that you've enjoyed about my books haven't necessarily been the policing side. So the new book, it's about a couple who disagree on the end-of-life care for their critically ill son. And so it's about what happens when you've got a couple who love each other very much, but they love their son more. What happens to them as a couple? How do they come to terms with their respective decisions, and how does their life change as a result?
Can't wait to read it.
Thank you.
And is it also, does it have no element of crime in it at all?
It doesn't have a crime. It does have a court case, and the court case is really the central point of this book, because when two parents disagree over what they do, over medical care, the court has to step in and decide. And so the investigation process is one of medical, the doctors giving evidence, and the court process is around what should happen to this child and whose interests need to be upheld first. And the big question in it really is what is a life? Is it just being alive? That these parents are faced with the choice of a child who passes away now, or who lives longer with profound disabilities, and the question they have to come to terms with is how important quality of life is for somebody.
I would normally have asked maybe another author if that's not a big risk you're taking, because you are, your books that have been very successful are crime thrillers, and now you're moving. But in your case, I think there has been a strong emotional undercurrent in all your books. So I think that is something that appealed to me a lot, and that's what I found very different about your books. So I'm sure that it will be really a good read again.
Thank you. I mean, that's exactly the conversations that we had behind the scenes before I started writing this book. Because, like you, I was sort of quite concerned that I should stick to one genre. But you're right. I don't write traditional cop fiction. It always has a strong emotional side. So I think actually when you read this book, you'll feel that it's not so very different.
That's quite reassuring. What about your colleagues, Claire, your police colleague? When they read your book, what do they have to say?
They've been really nice about it. I was really worried, really nervous that I'd get lots of messages from former colleagues saying that I'd done this wrong or that wrong, but actually they've all been very supportive. I have a fair number of male colleagues, always male colleagues, who email to say, I've read your book, that's me, isn't it, that character, you based it after me. And most of the time I can't even remember working with these people, so why I'd write a whole book about them, I don't know. But that seems to be a common theme, is trying to spot where I might have...
Do they like that? They want to be there in your book?
Yes, and quite often I will ask my former colleagues who wants to be a named character. You know, give me we call them shoulder numbers. You know, every police officer has a number on their shoulder. So I'll say, right, give me a shoulder number for the next police character in my book. And there'll be a big clamour of people that want to be the police officer, and I'll use one of them in the book.
Your book, I See You, has left a kind of trail of fear in me after reading it, really. And I think that's true of probably everybody who reads it, because it talks about commuting by train on a daily basis. I mean, I'm telling you, not her, she knows what her book is about. And it talks about the protagonist. She is traveling by train, commuting by train every day. And she's busy with her work. She doesn't like her work very much, and she comes home and she's leading a kind of an average life, average woman's life. And then suddenly one day she opens the newspaper in the train on her commute, and she sees her picture in the paper. She sees a picture and she sees a website there, and she is very worried, but people at home tell her that no, don't worry, this is not you, you're just imagining it, it's a figment of your imagination, but she knows it's her. And then she sees another woman's picture, again in the same newspaper columns, same columns, and after a while that woman is found murdered. And now she gets very, very worried. And soon, I mean, I'm not giving away the plot of the book because this is all from the blurb. It is there, I've checked, and not want to give away the plot. But after there onwards, it's like, it's very thrilling, it's exciting, and you feel you're in the book and there are eyes on you all the time. And ever since, I really feel when I go out, I feel like, you know, there could be somebody who's watching and you don't even know, you don't feel it. Although most of the time you think that you can feel eyes on yourself. But so, and then the twists, what is very interesting in Claire's books are the twists and turns. I spoil whatever movies I'm watching, I spoil them not just for myself but also for my children and my husband, because I tell them, okay, I know, this is the murderer, this is what is going to happen, I think this will happen. I'm just guessing. But most often it turns out to be true. And then they hate me for it because they say, you really spoil our movie, now we know you know who the murderer is if you've told us. But with Claire's books, I seriously could not. I just could not figure out. I don't know how you manage that. Those twists and turns and then the sudden shock. It's like you just have to stop reading at that point and fling the book aside and say, no way, this couldn't be happening. How do you manage that? How difficult is it?
It's really hard, actually. And I had, so I gave a talk an hour or so ago over in the library, and I spoke to one of the younger audience members afterwards who had such a brilliant question to me. So she is writing herself, and she said, in detective novels, the person who did it, is always the least likely person. And so when I read a novel, I just look for the least likely person, and it's always them. And she's absolutely spot on that actually you can't do that anymore because readers are too clever. You know, you're all armchair detectives. You make our job very, very hard. And so what I do, my approach is to give everybody a possible motive. So really, you could probably change the ending of my books and make someone else the suspect because they've all got motivation to do it. And so it's a constant game of sort of misdirection to push the readers in one direction and then push them in another, and to bury clues. I do a lot of clue burying. So it's a little bit like the main action happening on this side of the stage, and I'll be doing something in the corner that you'll sort of notice out of the corner of your eye, but you don't pay attention to it because the real action's here, and it's only at the end of the book that you realise what was happening over there was really important.
So it is very important after finishing your book to go back to the beginning again. You have to read the first half again to figure out what are the clues that you've planted there, and then one would be able to crack your style.
Well, and this is what I do as a sort of a writer researching, is I will often read other crime novels twice. And I'll do exactly that. I'm looking for where they've laid that trail.
Yeah, but something very interesting happens. I don't know if it happens to everyone. I've never really asked anyone. When I read a book, especially a crime thriller, where there are too many twists and turns, and I finish reading it, after some time I forget who was the person who was the the whodunit. I forget who was the criminal actually. It's somehow, there have been so many twists and turns that actually when you realize, okay, this is it, after some time I forget, and then I can happily read.
Yes, I love that. I've just read Murder on the Orient Express, Agatha Christie, for what must be the 4th or 5th time, and every single time I've forgotten. And in fact, Agatha Christie is brilliant for that, because I also read, what's the one where they're on the island in the hotel, and then there were none, which has a brilliant twisty ending, and I'd completely forgotten that as well.
Why does that happen?
I don't know.
It's interesting that because you're able to read it again, watch the movie again. I thought it happened only to me.
And I wonder if it is the fact that it could have been any of them, because Agatha Christie does that as well. She sets up every single character, and so maybe that's why it's harder to remember. Whereas if the baddie was obvious all the way through, you'd probably remember it.
Well, you'll be happy to know it happens with your books as well. I mean, I'll have to read them again to figure out. So, when you build your characters, you've said once that it's not necessary that the characters should be likable. It's necessary that they should be relatable, they should be believable. How do you build your characters? And does the character come to you first, or does the plot come to you first?
Good question. It depends, is the answer to whether it's plot or character. Generally it's plot, and then I'll build the characters afterwards. I like writing ordinary people because I want readers to be able to read my books and think, that could be me, how would I feel if I was in those shoes? And I think it's really hard to do that if you've got a character who's really sort of exotic and aspirational. I also think that ordinary people are much more interesting. So if you put an ordinary person in an extraordinary situation, that's what holds my interest, because the stakes are really high. If you've got James Bond going into a situation, going into a fight, you know he's going to win. And so, yeah, okay, it's exciting to watch it because there's lots of special effects and action. But ultimately, the stakes are low because Bond always wins. If you've got a housewife in her late 30s going into battle with somebody, that's quite exciting because who on earth is going to win? She's got no special skills, she can't do karate, she hasn't got a watch that turns into a laser. What she has got is huge amounts of inner strength, and I'm a passionate believer in the fact that women in particular are tigers inside. And we often think that we're weaker than other people, that we're weaker than men, and we think that we couldn't handle ourselves in a situation that demanded it. And when it happens, I think we surprise ourselves because we are incredibly strong.
Yes, I do believe that. So, your central character is always a strong woman. Have you ever thought about, in a crime thriller, mostly it is a woman, most often. But have you thought about doing a book around a guy? Would that be tough for you?
No, well, so my next book, the one I've just finished writing after the end, is completely split between the husband and the wife. And so that was really interesting. And in fact, when I got to the end of it, I asked my editor, who is a woman, whether or not we could give it to one of her colleagues, one of her male colleagues, to read it, because I wanted some feedback on the male voice and whether it felt authentic. Were these thoughts that a man would be having? Because it is different. Anyway, so his feedback was really useful on that, and I enjoyed the process. I think I've written male characters before, but they've been detectives, and it was slightly different writing someone vulnerable.
Yeah, someone into whose psyche you would have to delve, someone from within whom you would be taking decisions and feeling the emotions and the turbulence and all.
Yes, because this is the first time that I've written from the first person perspective. It's always been third person when I've written a man before. So I was sort of inside their head and dealing with emotion, and I wasn't sure I knew how a man would feel emotionally about a subject. So that was very interesting.
And the readers of psychological crime fiction are mostly women, aren't they? Is that right?
Yeah, well, readers in general, certainly in the UK, the vast majority of readers are women.
And then if it has to be a relatable character, then you would have to have a woman as your main character, if it is mostly women reading that.
Yeah, I think it helps, certainly.
Also more interesting to have a woman and the way her mind works and the way she thinks and feels.
We're certainly multifaceted in that respect. I think probably as well it relates the sad statistics in the world today, which is that the majority of violence happens against women. And also the fact that even where there isn't violence, women are much more frightened of violence. So when I was writing I See You, I remember a conversation with my husband about walking home. So I was talking about the fact that when I walk home late at night, I carry my keys in my hand. So a bunch of keys in my hand with keys poking through my fingers, like that, okay? And he looked at me like I was mad, and he said, "Why would you carry your keys in your fist?" And I said, "Well, in case I'm attacked." And he said, "But why would you be attacked?" I said, "Oh, just because I'm a woman, and that's just how it is. I don't really think about it anymore. And he said, "I have never ever walked home from the pub and thought that I might be attacked." And I said, "Well, there you go. That's the difference. I have never walked home from a pub late at night and not thought that I might be attacked." And the idea of two people the same age growing up with that completely different approach, I found quite startling.
And corresponding to your car keys, I used to carry a rolled up newspaper with me. I don't know how that would help. But working with the Times of India, that was the most handy thing. Well, and I would always carry a rolled up paper.
Actually, I think that's quite practical.
I don't know how it would help to whack somebody on the head with a newspaper. It wouldn't really help with it. So it's very interesting talking to you about your books. I want to know, do you also write poetry?
I always used to say that I don't write poetry at all, and that I didn't really understand poetry. And then actually, I wrote a poem about 2 weeks ago and put it on my blog. And so I can't say that I don't write poetry because it's there on my blog. I have to be really moved to write something. And this particular day, it was actually. It was my son's birthday, and my son was a twin, and his twin was the child of mine who died. And so his birthday is a real bittersweet day. And I was really struggling with trying to be happy while I was grieving so much. And it's 12 years ago, but as you can tell, it's still really, really difficult. And I wanted to write, and the thing that came out, the thing that wanted to be written was a poem, and so I wrote a poem about grief. And I think it's interesting that I didn't choose to write a chapter of a book or a piece of prose, or there is something about poetry that enables us to convey emotion in a way that no other medium permits.
That's true. I haven't seen your poem. I don't know why I even asked you the question. Interesting that you just wrote that. Have you watched any Indian movie ever or read books by Indian authors?
I'm ashamed to say I haven't.
You can always start now.
I know. Well, I bought one today. I bought Mr. Bond's book this morning. One of them. I couldn't buy all of them. And so I shall make a start there. Who would you recommend?
You want me to tell you right here at the Literature Festival as director?
Oh, that's true. You can't. That's like choosing your favourite child, isn't it?
Off the stage.
Okay, off stage. You can give me a reading list then.
Shall we throw the house open for questions, please?
Oh, come on. You've got, yes, you over there. I think you're going to get, are we going to get a microphone? Do you want this one? And the rest of you can be thinking of questions now. I'm not letting you out until we've had some more questions.
Hi. Actually, I'm here because of Vinita. Because the moment
That's put me in my place.
No. I just wanted to start because
I'm here because of Claire, so that's okay.
No, the thing is that every Sunday morning starts with a section on the speaking tree, and she's beautiful. I mean, she's a role model. It's very good for me, and I'm a very old woman, retired professor. Yeah, I'm a retired professor, and I always think how she can come up with something so very positive. And I came here to see how she would interview a crime thriller, which was really very, very exciting because she talks of everything but crime. And the interview today was so beautiful that I really cannot put my any words into it because I just heard Claire talk in the library about how she wrote a book. But the things that you both brought today was really something which every writer and a reader would like to hear about. That is about how women deal with issues, how women deal with writing and crime, and how there are so many things which are common between UK and India. So I really want to thank both of you for having given me a lot of things to think about when I go back. But I do also have one question.
Thank you very much. Yes, please.
The one thing is, to Claire, is that India has now seen a lot of autobiographical writing. And sometimes it can get really, being an avid reader, it can get really irritating at times to listen to the stories about women and all the problems they had in their life. But what I would like to know is, when does a writer get beyond autobiography? And does she ever get beyond autobiography?
I don't think I understand your question. I'm so sorry.
Oh, well, then you'll have to read a lot of Indian women authors with nowadays. And there's a lot of, emotional writing of how, what the problems they had in life, and, how they were feminist, or they were this or that. But when you started your discussion, you started with being that, when you were trying to, how should I put it, you grieved for your son, and then your first book happened. So does autobiography form an important part of any writing?
Oh, I see. Does it inform part of fiction as well? I think it probably does. I mean, it's hard, isn't it? Because every writer will be different, and I'm sure there are writers that don't put any of themselves into their books. For me, it's a really critical part of my writing, not just in terms of the emotion that I'm putting into the words, but also in terms of the themes. And so if I'm wanting to explore grief, then I'm doing it through fiction. The point about my next book, this medical conflict, is born out of the fact that is a decision that I had to make about my own child. and it's about the what ifs. You know, we're all plagued by what ifs. What if we'd taken that path instead of that path? And in doing it in a book, it gives me a little bit of distance from it, so that I'm not torturing myself because it's happening to two different people. It's happening to characters. It's not happening to me in my life. And I think it's a way of working through it. So for me, it's an absolute critical that I have some autobiographical parts in my books.
They say that the most honest autobiography is the one that you put in fiction, because you can always pretend it's happening to somebody else. You don't have to say.
Thank you. Has anybody else got a question? Yeah. Oh, look, we make you work here. You have to go and get your own mic.
Hello, ma'am. My name is Rohit. My question is that you said today that a part of you is in between any characters. So, in Zoe and Kelly Swift, what trait of your characters can you?
In Zoe and
Kelly Swift.
Kelly Swift. I loved Kelly Swift.
Me too.
So Zoe, I think, represents the sort of the ordinary bit of me. The fact that ultimately I'm like most women, trying to be a bit of everything to everyone, trying to sort the kids out in the house, and not having a huge amount of time for me as an individual. There's probably more of me in Kelly Swift than in Zoe. I wrote Kelly really as being the sort of detective that I used to be when I was young and thrusting and maybe a bit hot-headed. I didn't lose my temper quite as much as Kelly did. I certainly never beat anyone up. But yeah, there's a lot of me in Kelly. I'd love to bring Kelly back at some point and write something else with her.
And another thing, ma'am, being an Indian, I have no idea, that's why I'm asking. Is the London Tube really that kind of creepy place?
I think I would get in trouble with the London Underground if I told you that it was. No, I have absolutely exaggerated the amount of risk involved there, and there are a huge number of CCTV cameras that really do keep people safe. But personally, I find it a really creepy place, and it's not just London. I hate any underground train. Do you have underground trains in Calcutta?
Yes.
Do you?
So we know that only because after reading your book, I look everyone suspicious.
Quite right too. I think you should always be suspicious of everyone. No, I hate being underground. I find it a very uncomfortable situation. I'm very conscious of, you know, disasters, bombs, fires, things that could happen there. And at night, when someone's walking behind you and their footsteps echo, it's a horribly creepy place. We've got time for one more. Right at the back. Did you have your hand up right at the back there? No, maybe not. Anyone got a final question?
Is there some
Oh, great, yes, right next to you.
She has a question.
We'll have two. We'll have two, and then I promise we'll stop.
First of all, just to tell you that I'm also very ashamed of not having read any of your books.
It's okay, you can
I will
rectify
remedy
that.
that. My point is, being a detective, how difficult was it for you to get into the minds of criminals? And how much did that influence your writing?
I actually found it really quite easy to get into the minds of criminals, and I think that's specifically what encouraged me to write about crime. Because, and I apologise for repeating myself to anyone that came to my talk earlier, I feel very strongly that we're all capable of committing crimes. There's a very, very thin line between right and wrong. And sometimes circumstances push us to cross it. And what was interesting for me as a police officer was to talk to criminals and to understand their mentality, to ask them how they got to this point. And some of that conversation wouldn't happen in an interview room. It would happen in the car when we were on our way to the police station, or it would happen when I took them into the backyard to have a smoke. And we couldn't talk about the crime, but we could talk about their lives and how they got to this point, and their drug habit or the relationship that broke down. And I once met a woman living on the streets who was exactly the same age as me. And we'd grown up in very similar parts of the country, and we'd both gone to university to read French. And at the end of her first year, her father had died, and she had spiraled into depression. She didn't have a great support network, she'd started taking drugs, and 4 years on, I had graduated and was a police officer, and she was living on the streets and was a heroin addict. And it made me realise how easily the scales can tip the wrong way for us. Oh, sorry, this gentleman here did have his hand up before.
Okay, so basically I'm a student of literature, currently in second year, and though our university doesn't allow much diversification and it's quite limited, but most of the writers I have read, I haven't really seen them exploring different genres, more than one. So why is that case? Why writing is a creative field, so why people don't explore different genres other than just one? They excel in that one specific genre, but why not in more than one or two?
It's a really boring answer, but I think it has more to do with what readers expect than what writers want to do. So I know lots of crime writers, for example, who really want to write science fiction. I know a crime writer who's desperate to write romance, but there's a fear that their readers won't come with them, that the readers want more of the same thing, and so they sort of get trapped in one genre.
The market dictates.
The market dictates. Okay, lady at the front.
Hi, Vinita. Hi, Clare. Being a cop and you're writing on crime and thrillers is an extension of the work you've already done. So you're creating stories based on whatever you have done so far. It's a question like, these cases must be haunting your mind, your characters must be haunting your mind. What do you do to get a good night's sleep? Do these, constantly?
I'm a
because
terrible
like
sleeper.
I am a power system engineer. I design thermal power plants. So when I get up, start up in a project, these things go in my mind. Then the generator is not working, the breakers there is not working. These things, they are there in my mind. So what do you do to get a good night's sleep?
Oh my goodness, I feel like I should be asking everyone else for advice. I am the worst sleeper I know. I lie awake, however desperately tired I am. There's a bit in my brain that tells me how much I could achieve if I didn't go to sleep. And so I really struggle with sleep. What I do, in fact, is I listen to audiobooks, and that's what sends me to sleep. Not because they're boring, but because it just fills enough of my mind to stop me thinking about other things. But I do a lot of exercise, go for walks with the dog, and I like swimming. I like wild swimming in the lake. So I'll go and swim in the lake all year round when it's freezing in Britain. It's like 2 degrees in the water, and I'll still swim. And that's great for kind of clearing the mind. But I don't know. When you find an answer, let me know.
Thank you so much. I promise you all I did not plot anybody here. Unless there's another question, we could take one, but there doesn't seem to be another. So I think we're done. Thank you very much. Thank you for being a lovely interactive audience. Thank you so much, Claire. It's been lovely talking to you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Claire.